Alejandro, buenos días a todos. Es un gusto compartir una vez más un panel en la CIP sobre la cuestión del valor del contenido periodístico en el ecosistema digital, de la compensación que los medios entendemos nos corresponde por el uso de este contenido periodístico por parte de las diferentes plataformas digitales. Creo que hemos venido trabajando desde la CIP y desde otras organizaciones de la región proactivamente en estos temas desde hace ya varios años, en diálogo y en negociación con las propias plataformas. Destaco, como lo hizo ayer el presidente de la CIP, como lo hizo ayer el propio Ricardo Trotti, perdón, anteayer el presidente de la CIP y ayer el propio Ricardo Trotti, cuando presentó las iniciativas que estamos realizando, por ejemplo, con Google y nuestra institución, pero nosotros siempre hemos puesto también en la agenda la cuestión de los abordajes que distintos países han tenido respecto de esta cuestión de los contenidos periodísticos y qué resultados se fueron obteniendo en cada uno, también como una forma de medir cuáles son las distintas alternativas con las que cuenta la industria a la hora de conseguir resultados efectivos, rápidos y concretos para una industria que está en una situación de mucha vulnerabilidad y de mucha crisis, por lo que contaba ya Ricardo, ¿no? Porque claramente ha cambiado el modelo de negocios y gran parte de nuestros ingresos tradicionales ahora han virado al mundo digital y en particular a las grandes plataformas que concentran, bueno, una porción importantísima de esos ingresos. En esta ocasión, el panel va a hacer foco en la evolución de dos proyectos legislativos, uno en Estados Unidos, otro en Canadá, que de alguna manera siguen el camino iniciado en 2018 por la Unión Europea y luego por Australia, que fueron de alguna manera dos hitos en la cuestión de la remuneración de los contenidos periodísticos, y para actualizarnos respecto de la evolución de estos proyectos, de los riesgos que enfrentan, de los desafíos que enfrentan, de los logros que van teniendo y también de las trabas y de los frenos. Dos personas de alguna manera viejos amigos de la CIP y muy respetados, como son Danielle Coffey de la News Media Alliance de los Estados Unidos y Paul Deegan de la News Media Canadá. Danielle es vicepresidenta ejecutiva y consejera general de la News Media Alliance, que representa a 2.000 medios de comunicación de todo el mundo. Dirige la defensa y la estrategia de la organización. Fue vicepresidenta y consejera general de la Asociación de la Industria de las Telecomunicaciones en los Estados Unidos. Es licenciada en Derecho, con una especialización en Derecho de la Comunicación. Nació y creció en California y se licenció en la Universidad de San Diego. En tanto, Paul Deegan es presidente y CEO de la News Media Canada desde junio de 2021. También es CEO de la firma Deegan Public Strategies en Toronto. Supervisa las operaciones diarias de News Media Canada y la prestación de una amplia gama de programas y servicios a sus medios. También es responsable de los expedientes políticos más críticos de la News Media Canada y de promover las posiciones en una serie de importantes asuntos a los que se enfrenta la industria de los medios de comunicación, obviamente entre ellos la cuestión de la remuneración de las plataformas. Quisiera entonces empezar pidiéndoles a Danielle y a Paul si nos pueden hacer una introducción cada uno sobre un update de cómo están los proyectos en cada uno de esos países. Sabemos que en el caso de Estados Unidos hubo un proyecto que estuvo a punto de aprobarse en diciembre del año pasado, pero que luego se frenó. Sabemos que en Canadá el proyecto está desde el año pasado presentado por el ministro de Cultura canadiense, pero aún no ha sido aprobado. Para que nos cuenten un poco cómo están cada uno de los proyectos en sus países, qué trabas han encontrado y qué perspectivas tienen a futuro. Gracias y le doy la palabra a Danielle.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate being here, especially with my friend Paul Deegan. I always like to do panels with him. We have a lot of fun because we're fighting together. We're fighting really strong adversaries, and we've had the same experiences. We're learning from each other, helping each other. Most recently, thank you for taking a look at that USTR letter. I'll just give a quick update on what's happening in the US as far as legislation. And again, it's very similar, like I said, to what Canada's experienced, but also in Australia and Europe. And a lot of the experiences are the same. The legislation is very similar. And what we want at the end of the day is to be compensated for our fair market value, which we are owed because we have quality journalism that's beneficial to society and has tremendous economic value as well. That's something that won't be acknowledged, but the marketplace has proven that that's the case. As far as what we're doing in the US, the JCPA almost got passed in December. It was at the finish line. Majority Leader Schumer of the US Senate was always supportive, but we have an expression, he put his money where his mouth is. And that means that he demonstrated his leadership in attaching the JCPA, and everybody knows what the JCPA is. It's modeled after Australia, baseball style arbitration, just like Canada, and it would make Google and Facebook ultimately pay for news content. And he attached it to the NDAA, the defense bill, which is what we call must pass. So that it goes forward no matter what, it pays soldiers, and everybody, both sides of the aisle, want it to pass. And something being attached to it makes it the chances of passage tremendous, very, very high. We got four corners, meaning we got Schumer, Minority Leader McConnell, Pelosi, and McCarthy, if you can believe it, to agree to include the JCPA in the NDAA, the defense bill. At the very last minute, there was many factors that went into what the final passage looked like. I truly believe that time was our biggest enemy, that leaving the bill open for further negotiation when it was set to be voted on the very next day, and leaving 2 days extra was our biggest enemy, because during that period of time, negotiations started back up about what would be attached, and the JCPA, among other items, got stripped from the bill. The Senate Republicans wanted a clean NDA because they felt the Democrats were asking for too much. And we were a bystander of that negotiation process. Other factors weighed in. We had Meta threaten to take news out of the United States, as they have done. Sorry, I cannot say that without laughing. As they have done in other countries. Very, very undemocratic of them and unbecoming, but that is what they do. We had, we have a kind of off the wall paper called Breitbart. They also weighed in. We had other factors that I won't go into, but we had many factors. But really, I truly believe that we did not get attached at the end of the day because we were the bystander of too lengthy of negotiations. So the bill, it was that not included. And at the beginning of the new Congress, the 118th Congress, I wasn't sure what would happen. I wasn't sure if how Congress would feel about renewing our bill. And I was pleasantly surprised that they were even more eager to push forward because it got so close. And they saw that they had the votes, and they saw that this is not just a worthwhile, which they had always agreed with, but that it was a doable piece of legislation. And so that's why at the beginning of this year, about a month ago, Senator Klobuchar reintroduced the bill. It's set to be marked up over the next month or so. This work period, they call it work periods, and the next one is the longest one of the year. So they are set to mark that up in this work period. And then passage will include many hurdles again. We will need to be putting out many fires. Paul and Ricardo will be hearing from me because I'm sure we will be meeting many challenges. But we are up for that fight because this is a critical piece of legislation. Another thing that I'll mention in my opening is what will be helpful with the federal bill is we also now have a state bill, and it's not just any state, it's California. And the expression is, so goes California, so goes the country, meaning they usually get out ahead. They've done it with privacy, and then the rest of the country follows. The California bill just passed the policy committee Tuesday evening, and with a vote of 9-0, and that's despite the tremendous opposition that Google and Facebook displayed in California as well. They even have groups in every state to lobby. So that passed 9-0, and we believe that also puts more pressure on the federal government to act in this space. So we're very pleased with the progress that we've seen both at the state and federal level. We're feeling very energized and very encouraged. We're fighting for the right, we're on the right side of history here. We're fighting for quality journalism, and I love to be a part of this group that's doing the same thing across the world. Thank you for having me.
Gracias, Danielle. Antes de pasar a Paul, me gustaría hacerte una breve pregunta. En esta reintroducción del proyecto por la senadora Klobuchar y el senador Kennedy, ¿hay algún cambio, alguna modificación respecto del proyecto del año pasado o es el mismo proyecto?
Same bill that was passed out of committee, which is why markup voting in committee this year should not be a problem. Thank you.
Perfecto, muchas gracias. Paul, ¿quieres contarnos cómo viene el proceso de la ley en Canadá, que ya lleva un año desde que fue presentada por el ministro de Cultura?
Thank you very much, Martin. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be with Danielle. But before I begin, I just want to sort of thank the Inter-American Press Association. You're an amazing group. We're proud to be a part of you. 60 years ago, and just 4 days before his death, President Kennedy addressed the Inter-American Press Association in Miami, and he said, this association and its members carry a very large responsibility for the defense of freedom in the hemisphere. And I couldn't agree more. And with that, I just want to pay tribute to Ricardo, who is really the glue that has sort of kept all of us together. So Ricardo, thank you so much for everything you do. In terms of our legislation, and I'll back up just a little bit before it was introduced. So a couple of years ago, we were looking at, what is the best way to address this issue of remuneration between big tech platforms and publishers. And we really looked at 3 different approaches. One was copyright, which we figured in Canada would take 10 years to probably deal with. So that, that was off the table. The other one, which was out there, was a fund. So basically tax the platforms, have them pay into a fund. We didn't like that because we thought that was getting government too much into the business of picking in winners and losers. And then the third one was what Rod Sims was doing in Australia with the News Bargaining Code. And I think all of us owe Rod a really huge debt of gratitude in terms of having the vision to with that legislation. It's really a great model. It's very simple. It's collective negotiation, something we can't do currently under our Competition Act in Canada, and then backed up by baseball-style arbitration. So in terms of where our legislation was at, Martin, as you mentioned, it was introduced just a little over a year ago. It went through our House of Commons, which is our lower house. We have a bicameral system in Canada. So we have an elected House of Commons and an unelected Senate. So it got through the House of Commons just before Christmas. And a few key changes were made to it, amendments that we and others pushed for. And I'll just outline a couple of them. One is in the original version of the bill, you had to basically adhere to certain criteria, which were part of what was essentially the criteria for the Canadian labor tax credit. That was one. And then there was sort of another criteria, which is basically said you have to have 2 employees, but it was, from our perspective, too loosey-goosey. So it wasn't clear in terms of, did those publishers with just 2 employees have to, subscribe to editorial standards, codes of conduct, and things like that. So we pushed for that, and the platforms pushed for that as well. And I think that's a good amendment. The other one is, it was unclear in the original version of the bill if the owner, operator, journalist counted towards that 2-employee minimum. So we got that language clarified. So that's very important. We have quite a few small independent mom and pop newspapers in Canada. that would serve a community of, let's say a newspaper with a, print circulation of 800 to 1,000 or so. We've got a good number of those. They're vital to their communities. And so we've got those folks included now, which is terrific. The bill is now before our Senate. And it's just moved to the Transport and Communications Committee. They actually had their first hearing on Tuesday. We're expecting that it will go through that process with our Senate. We've got some former journalists on that Senate committee, which I think is interesting because they'll have good insights into the industry. So we're looking forward to sort of working with parliamentarians. We believe there's still opportunity. It's a very good bill. It's excellent, but there's still opportunities to make it better. So, for example, in there was no time frame initially when the bill was introduced related to negotiation, mediation, and arbitration. We had pushed for 45 days for each of those three steps, and the House of Commons came back with 120, 90, and 45. I think we're still going to push as this goes through the Senate to tighten that up closer to 45, 45, 45 again. And we're also looking at some other language just to tighten up the bill. So from our perspective, it's good legislation. There's still an opportunity to make it better. We look forward to working with our parliamentarians. And we would say to the tech platforms, there's an opportunity right now still for you to try to improve the bill, as long as we keep the central tenets of the bill, which are the collective negotiation backed up by baseball style arbitration. So our hope is that the Senate committee will deal with this by the end of May, and then there may be some back and forth between the House of Commons and the Senate, but this legislation passes by the end of June. And then this summer, we're negotiating with both Google and Meta to make sure that our members are compensated for the valuable content that their journalists create. Thank you.
Gracias, Paul. Muy interesante lo que contaste. A ver si entiendo bien para recapitular. Tú piensas que para el mes de junio de este año puede estar aprobada la legislación, eso lo entendí bien. Y el segundo punto, te quería preguntar, hubo bastante polémica respecto de algunas actitudes que tomaron las plataformas, tanto Meta como Google, respecto de quizás la amenaza de que el contenido periodístico iba a ser de alguna manera restringido de algunas de sus aplicaciones por el riesgo que ellos llaman riesgo regulatorio, y la famosa cuestión de que no estaba claro que era un medio de comunicación y que podía ser demasiado amplia la definición. Estas cuestiones se han ido solucionando. ¿Cómo está hoy la relación o el rol de las plataformas respecto del proceso de aprobación de la ley?
Yeah, thank you, Martin. So we think that the bill itself is quite clear in terms of what's a news outlet. There's actually specific language. So, for example, lifestyle publications aren't included. So we think it's quite clear. I think everyone knows news when they see it. So people know what we're talking about here. In terms of the platforms, they've been engaged in some tactics, which, we don't think, frankly, are in their self-interest. The threat of blocking, and indeed, Google actually, through search, restricted access to roughly 4% of Canadian news content over a period of 4 or 5 weeks. That did not go over well with our parliamentarians. I think that really, in terms of their own reputation, they took a hit on that. And, the message that we would have for the platforms is, you're a valuable partner. We've worked well with you in the past. We want to work well with you in the future. If you have specific amendments to, improve language, we're happy to work with you. I'm sure, members of our House and Senate are happy to work with you, but let's get this across. They have actually been compensating publishers in Canada for a couple of years now. In advance of the legislation being introduced, they started doing deals with the largest Canadian news publishers. And, my understanding from those publishers, even though they're covered, it's under NDA, but they're pleased with what they've received from that. So what we really want to do is make sure that all publishers, all legitimate news publishers in Canada get the same compensation that the big players have. It's a matter of fairness, it's a matter of equity, and it's a matter of protecting local news in communities across Canada.
Gracias, Paul. Justamente tú acabas de introducir un tema que quería plantearles tanto a Danielle como a ti, que es respecto de algunos cambios que tuvo el proyecto de preservación del periodismo de Estados Unidos el año pasado, cuando restringió el alcance a los medios de menos de 1.500 empleados, como una forma, tengo entendido, Danielle, de favorecer la aprobación del proyecto frente a las críticas de algunos sectores políticos que decían que esto era para favorecer a las grandes corporaciones mediáticas, y conocemos la historia de sectores republicanos enfrentados con los grandes medios de Estados Unidos. Al mismo tiempo, hemos visto que se han anunciado acuerdos de, por ejemplo, Google con grandes media outlets de Estados Unidos. Estos acuerdos, y también en Canadá, por lo que acaba de contar Paul. Entonces les quiero preguntar a ambos, ¿estos acuerdos, ustedes creen que debilitan la posibilidad de la aprobación de las leyes, o al revés, que el proceso y digamos el camino que han iniciado los proyectos legislativos han favorecido estos acuerdos individuales? ¿Ustedes tienen una mirada crítica de estos acuerdos o les parecen que están bien, que son legítimos?
You want me to start, Paul?
Sure.
So I have a long held belief that they're outside with a monopoly and a broken marketplace. There is no such thing as a fair market value that will ever be paid without a legal right to be paid, because then it's up to the benevolence and the calculations and the picking and choosing of the platforms in order to determine what they can do in order to avoid legislation. And we saw a real life example of that with the Facebook News tab that began, I want to say it was 2019, 2020 maybe. They started paying news publishers and broadcasters, and they paid about 20 or 30 of them. And who they didn't pay was what Paul just said, which is they don't pay the small local papers, but they rely on their content tremendously, especially, across a vast country like the US, and I know Canada has the same situation. So with a broken marketplace agreements will never by definition be fair market value, because you don't have the leverage, especially of the smaller players. The must-have news publications may end up being paid, but we even saw with News Tab that went away, and that was another, again, move on the part of Meta to cease operations of their News Tab, so that they no longer had to pay. And we believe that could have been motivated by a reality they want to create, that they don't need news. They've said that publicly, so we know that's the reality that they would like to get across. They don't need news. We know that that's a fallacy, because we've heard from their own users, 54% of Facebook users said they want more local news. So we know that that's not true, but the perception they would like to create is that there's not a need, so there's also no need for payment, which is why a legal right is so imperative. And with the showcase that started in other countries, what the US news publishers, that has not started in the US, because I think that there is a recognition that that is not a fair market value of the revenue that's being generated by the platforms based off our content, and what they are offering is not a reflection of that value. So that has not started in the US. So I can't answer your question as to whether or not those payments have impacted legislation, because those payments have actually not been made, because they don't even come close to the mark.
Paul?
So in Canada, we've got, like everywhere else in the world, we have this unlevel playing field, right, between publishers and platforms. Once Google and Meta started doing deals with our larger publishers, we got into another unlevel playing field between publishers. So, if you're a publisher and you're being compensated for your content, and then the smaller player isn't being compensated, that's unfair. So I actually think, in terms of sort of, the impetus for this legislation, them doing deals with the larger players is actually helping the smaller players, because the politicians get it, right? They see, you know, reinvestment in our larger players, and, you know, with the smaller players, you know, it's a disaster. So that's actually helped. We also just, in terms of being a little different than the United States, we have a larger land mass, Canada, than the US, but we've got about 1/10 the population. So our small local communities are actually a lot smaller than a lot of these, you know, more, you know, the smaller communities in the US. So these are vital publications. Like, there's basically the local newspaper, and then there's the public broadcaster. That's it. There's nothing left. And these publications are run by families. They're often, you know, 3 or 4 generations they've been running this paper. They were good businesses for a long time, but unfortunately, in terms of the way that the advertising market has changed, you know, they're really challenged. And so we need this legislation. The other thing I would say is, and, you know, it's not a silver bullet. There are other issues that we need to address. You know, I think governments have to fund local journalism positions in rural and remote communities to fill news deserts. That's got to happen. We need advertising. Corporations need to step up with advertising. Governments need to step up with advertising. We've got things like recycling fees on newspapers that are essentially a job-killing tax. Like, all of these issues have to be dealt with. You know, the remuneration from Google and Meta is important, but it's not the only thing that needs to be done. And I think as an industry, we've got to make sure that we're focused on all these issues simultaneously. You know, we need labor tax credits for journalism. We need digital subscription tax credits. All of these things are vital. And, you know, we can't just have our business model hanging on compensation from Google and Meta. We need all of these things, and we need to reinvest in our product, which will drive quality journalism. It's what's going to drive subscription revenue, and that's really the future for all of us.
Gracias a los dos. De paso, los invito a quienes están asistiendo a este panel, que veo que hay 85 participantes, que puedan, por favor, acercar sus preguntas, tanto en el chat como levantando la mano. Me gustaría ahora pasar a un tema que es el tema de el valor de los montos, algo que, Danielle, tú decías que no hay un fair market value, claramente, en las propuestas individuales que hacen las plataformas a los medios. Y yo quería preguntarte, porque hay un viejo estudio de la News Media Alliance del año 2018, creo, 2019, que hablaba de que el aporte de la industria de los medios a Google era alrededor de 4.700 millones de dólares. Ahora conocimos un reciente estudio, muy reciente, de la Asociación Suiza de Editores de Medios, no sé si ustedes lo recuerdan, que hizo una investigación en febrero de este año, que hizo una consultora contratada por la Asociación Suiza, la consultora Fair Advice and Partner, a 1.572 personas, hizo un estudio sobre el uso del buscador de Google y cuánto de estas búsquedas estaban vinculadas a las noticias y cuántos ingresos de los que generaba Google estarían relacionados con búsquedas vinculadas a las noticias, y la conclusión es que el valor concreto de del contenido de los medios hacia Google, en el caso de Suiza, era alrededor de 170 millones de dólares por año. Entonces ahí empiezan a aparecer números de valor. Yo les quería preguntar a ambos, para sus estudios, para sus trabajos vinculados con la legislación, ¿tienen estimaciones de cuál debería ser el aporte de las grandes plataformas a la industria de los medios a nivel global? Y segundo, ¿qué esquema o si tienen algún tipo de idea o de aproximación respecto de cómo debería o cuáles deberían ser los parámetros para remunerar a cada medio en particular? Si esto tiene que ver con la cantidad de empleados, con el tipo de periodismo de calidad que se hace, con el tipo, por ejemplo, con la cantidad de visitas en la web o algún otro parámetro. Esas serían mis dos preguntas. El monto global que las plataformas deberían darle a la industria, y segundo, a cada medio, a cada outlet, qué parámetros se deberían tener en cuenta a la hora de esa remuneración.
Paul, you want me to go?
Sure, perfect.
So the first question is an easy answer. I actually don't have a worldwide estimate. We're happy to take a look at it, but we could base it off of the same things as we would do to estimate what it would be here in the US. And we actually have the beauty of something to go on that's existing in real life, because Australia has a law. So like I said, and I stand behind it, a law is the only thing that's going to create a payment that reflects fair market value, because there's too many unknown factors that go into the decision making around why you would make a marketplace payment. And it could be based off the pressure of the legislature. It could be based off of public pressure. It could be based off of who, like we talked about earlier, picking winners and losers, how much you need them. So it will never reflect fair market value unless there's a legal right to payment like there is in Australia. So that's the best model to replicate, to be able to determine whether or not to set a benchmark. So in Australia, there was a law, and there were payments that were made, and it estimated around 140 million US dollars. Translated to the US market share, that would be billions in the US, and it would look a lot like estimates that we've estimated that we will be going to arbitrators with. And that's where we will have the fight with Google. I think that everybody's been very smart around the world and not having a public fight about the price of payment, because if there's a mechanism, or if there's a negotiating table that would determine that price, that is where that fight should be had, not in the press and not in the public, where Google will dominate with their tremendous resources. So when we have a fair and we have a legal mechanism to be able to make our case, that's where we will make it. But we've estimated, based off Australia, it is in the billions. We've also seen benchmarks around the world because of Europe. We've seen an estimate from Canada, which Paul will go into. We've seen an estimate from the UK and other places that reflect the same estimate that, again, translated to the US would be billions of dollars because of Google and Facebook's market share here. The second point that I wanted to make is around payments, because you asked what should the factors be around payments. So in all of the models that we've looked at, the value is assessed separately from the payments and what we call allocation share. So the value is stagnant and it's fixed, and it should not be determined, and it should be based on the negotiation or the arbitration or whatever mechanism you have to determine what that payment is. And it should be a legal mechanism that's established in law. And so that fixed payment should not be dependent on clicks or even reporters for that matter, because that should be the value that's independent from how each newsroom looks, rather what Google and Facebook receive. So that value is a pot. Think of it as a bucket, a pot. And what you're asking is, how do people take from that pot? That allocation could vary throughout countries and companies. That allocation, I believe, should be based in part, it has to be based in part by impressions. That's not clicks. Clicks are not impressions. Impressions are how much you're surfaced on the platform. And the reason why I believe that has to be a measurement is because that is what you're being paid for. It's the digital digestion of news on those platforms, which is what we're saying they generate revenue off of, and why they should pay in the first place. So that has to be a part of it. Like it or not, people don't like things being tied to impressions, but mind you, it's not clicks. Clicks are when they come through, and that's your traffic. Rather, impressions are how much we're surfaced on the platforms, and that is solely the decision of Google and Facebook. So clicks and people generating more content to try to get more money it's not correct. It's not accurate, because it's based off impressions, which is different than clicks. I just wanted to make that distinction because I think that that's something that's a misconception. The second part of it that could establish payment would be how many reporters you have. If we want to incentivize quality content, more reporters, more journalism, more, city halls being and school boards being covered, or the small, tiny newsrooms that Paul was talking about. Reporters are vital and integral to that process. So I do believe it makes sense to have a measurement also based on reporters and journalists. However, allocation share could be determined by state, country by country. Is up to that territory. But I do believe those two measurements make a lot of sense for the reasons I stated. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul?
Great. Thanks, Martin. So we don't have a global number ourselves. And in terms of Canada and an estimate, the government basically looked at what's happened in Australia, and they came up with a number, which is $215 million. I don't know if that number is accurate or not. But one of the differences between the Canadian legislation and the Australian is we have sort of a higher level of transparency. So, for example, the communications regulator in Canada will come out with an annual report which will detail the aggregate value of deals. So it won't get into everyone's specific deal, but the aggregate value of deals. But it's also asked for some transparency in terms of newsrooms. So we think, one of the things to look at it, and again, when you listen to Rod in terms of the success of their model, so he's speaking as a former chair of the ACC. That's not a government position in terms of the 200 million or more than 200 million Australian dollars. The other thing that he's referred to, and it's anecdotal, is the hiring environment for journalists in Australia has never been better. So, in terms of sort of the success of these codes, we think that, ultimately it is, have you stopped the bleeding in newsrooms and have you got people reinvesting? So that's important. On how it should be calculated, that's going to be a process that will determine through negotiation. And so we look forward to that. And I agree with Danielle on impressions versus clicks. In terms of how we would redistribute those funds, one of the things that we intend to do is create a relatively large collective of small publishers. And we'll run that through our association. We've also got the ethnic publishers in Canada aligned on that as well. So we'd form a collective. And I think ultimately, as you look at this, we want to raise all boats. So we think in terms of sort of how we would allocate, I think our primary way of looking at that would be through everyone's proportionate investment in their newsroom. Because ultimately what you want with this is money's reinvested in quality journalism. And that's the only thing that's going to sustain the business. And again, that's what's going to drive subscription revenue. That's what's going to keep advertisers and attract new advertisers. So the investment in newsroom is really what this is all about.
Clarísimo. Dos o tres cuestiones que han aparecido en los últimos días que me gustaría tener la opinión de ustedes. Muy rápido se las enumero. Nos enteramos que el día martes en el Congreso brasileño la Cámara de Diputados votó el tratamiento urgente, con lo cual esto se votaría en el recinto el próximo martes, del proyecto denominado Fake News, pero que tiene un artículo, además de toda la regulación de la fake news y de la moderación de contenidos, un artículo específico que dice que las compañías tecnológicas van a tener que pagar por el contenido periodístico y los valores deben ser negociados entre las partes. O sea, hay un primer proyecto legislativo en América Latina, es la primera vez que, si bien es un artículo dentro de un proyecto cuyo eje es otro, establece claramente la obligación del pago y la obligación de negociar, ¿no? Primer punto, me parece que es un dato a tener en cuenta porque es la primera vez que sucede en América Latina. Segundo, un dato que nos llamó la atención, un arbitraje en Alemania respecto de Corinth Media. Corinth Media es la sociedad, digamos, colectiva que negocia colectivamente los derechos de los medios más pequeños de Alemania en relación a la directiva europea. Corinth había, algo así como representa el 30% de los medios alemanes, había estimado que el valor que Google debería pagarle era alrededor de $400 millones, pero el dictamen fue mucho más bajo, fue alrededor de, entiendo, 4 o 5 millones, si tienen alguna mirada sobre eso. Y el tercer tema, que me gustaría también poner dentro de un comentario de ustedes, es una de las objeciones que se le hacía al proyecto de Canadá, era que los acuerdos, que por lo que sabemos tanto en los lugares donde hay legislación como en aquellos lugares donde las plataformas tienen acuerdos privados como Showcase, son confidenciales, y que la ley canadiense a diferencia de la australiana, obligaba a que fueran públicos, lo cual esto podía ser objetado tanto por las tecnológicas como por los medios. Quiero básicamente que ustedes me comenten sobre estas tres cuestiones.
Can I ask a question first? And Paul, you go first on this one. I just have a quick question. Was the current media determination made by
current media es una,
Yes,
es un
I'm
collective.
familiar. Yeah. Was it made by an arbitrator?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, okay, so I'll start off in order. So on Brazil, I think fantastic, and anything that we can do to help, you know, we'd love to. Our minister of heritage in Canada came from Canada, from Argentina as a little kid. So I'm sure if there's anything he can do to help out as well, I'm sure he'd be happy to do so. On the decision of the German arbitrator, I'm not familiar with that, but that sounds ridiculously low. And you know, our view of our legislation would be that you know, we're going to you know, have you know, fair arbitration. It's baseball style. It's final offer. You know, we'll put our number out. The platforms will put their number out, and we'll see where it goes. But that figure out of Germany just sounds unbelievably low. In terms of the our legislation on the transparency, so the individual deals won't be public. The arbitrator, so for example, if, you know, let's say party A negotiates a deal with Google, then when party B negotiates and it goes to arbitration, or if it does go to arbitration, and nothing has actually gone to arbitration in Australia, as we all know. So if it does go to arbitration, the arbitrator will be aware of the party A deal. So that will help them make a determination in terms of, you know, for the other party. So we think it's important that the arbitrator have the information on other deals, but in terms of the public, having aggregate information is the way to go. We want commercial-based solutions. And, you know, there is a need for government intervention here because we do have a market failure, but, you know, parties should be able to negotiate confidentially, and those agreements should stay confidential. That's our perspective.
Danielle, ¿quieres agregar algo?
Well, I love what's happening in Brazil. Anybody call me if you need my help there, because that's amazing. I heard from Anya Schifrin that was taking place in an exchange, and I'm very excited, and I'm happy to help in any way I can. As far as, I may not fly to Brazil by Tuesday, but we will help from afar. You know, it depends on if in the current media case where they arbitrated. You know, I love what APIG did in France. I thought that, you know, and the fact that they have a second round after their contract comes up, and that they have the DMA now, and they have other, you know, mechanisms to be able to get an even better deal. I like what happened there. As far as Germany, I would want to know. So it was very important to us because these are very squirrely folks. So Google and Facebook will do everything they're very, they'll obfuscate the process. What we did in our legislation to make sure that there's a fair process for payment was we put in place criteria by which you would determine what that payment should be. They'll say that we get traffic and that's our payment. First of all, it's not offset by traffic because we even get a portion of that because of their dominance in the advertising ecosystem, which is currently being litigated by our DOJ. So I don't believe that that's, first of all, it's not offset anyway. It should not offset the value they receive anyways, because we're not talking about what we get from them, which should only be a share of, they should still only be charging a share, not 100% of the input that we have on their platform, and it should not be offset by traffic. So our criteria actually outlines for an arbitrator that is not payment. We are entitled to 100% of our value that they benefit from us. And there's in the advertising ecosystem, the post click after the click is entirely separate because we're entitled to that anyways. That's our traffic. And they tax that too. So that's one of our criteria. Another one is we look at the criteria that we look at is you must look at outside commercial agreements taking place around the world that are comparable in conditions and terms and criteria by which they were determined. So that's another piece that has to come into play when an arbitrator would determine the value. So I don't know the criteria by which an arbitrator determined what the value is, but that is critical to what outcome is presented, and that would, and without knowing, I can't comment, but I will say that those factors are imperative.
Muchas gracias. Tengo un tema novedoso que quizás nos saca un poco de las plataformas de las que siempre hablamos, pero me parece muy importante porque la News Media Alliance ha sido, como en tantas cosas, pionera en advertir que la cuestión de la inteligencia artificial también requiere ser abordada con criterios de compensación por el uso de nuestros contenidos. Todo el mundo sabe que gran parte del chat GPT, todo lo que hemos visto en este año, y que Carlos Jornet ha dado clases magistrales del uso del chat en estos 2 días, se alimenta mucho y en una medida muy relevante del contenido de los medios de comunicación. Entonces, ahí hay otros actores, y me parece importante que la News Media Alliance ya haya emitido unos principios a ser seguidos tanto por la legislación como por las propias compañías respecto del uso y de la compensación del uso de la propiedad intelectual en la inteligencia artificial. Me gustaría que Danielle nos cuente brevemente este tema, y si Paul tiene algo para agregar también.
Well, the first thing that I'll say is there's no contributor to training of generative AI and predictive modeling like news publications. There's no other entity recording real life. All the big data that's derived so far is from the internet. Whether it's healthcare, financial data, so on and so forth. News publications are one of the only entities that exist that record real life and events that are then used in training and then transferred digitally and then used in training and predictive modeling and generative AI. So we are irreplaceable when it comes to our value contribution towards AI. And there is a market for that. We sell our data sets to academic institutions and others in order to, and we are paid for that. So there's a marketplace for data sets that train AI. So I'll just say that establish that value first. As far as our legal right to payment, we do believe that we have an unequivocal right because of what I said. There's an established marketplace. And we believe that, and we're entitled to compensation. And we also we are concerned, while generative AI is an innovative, transforming technology that we're very excited about, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, if there's not a compensation mechanism in place, that could be incredibly devastating to our industry, because there's no economic business model for us in AI, because by definition, it transforms our content and acts as a substitution for our content, which is a big factor when it comes to copyright, so that we don't get paid at all because there's no attribution, there's no link, there's no anything, because it is such a substitute. And so the same compensation problem exists as it did in search, except it's even worse. So the JCPA and also the California bill already accounts for the payments that should be made for all uses. That's why we're different from copyright, because payment for crawling content already accounts for AI, because that is one of the many ways in which our content is being used. We thought about AI, we knew it was coming, and we thought about it when we were crafting our legislation. So it does already address it. But I do think it makes it even more of a critical issue, because there's no business model for us in AI. And I think that legislators also see that, and it's a more compelling case for our argument here.
Very interesting. So you think that the GPCA and for example not the Australian but the Canadian law can cover the EA uses?
So I would just add to that two things. One is, I mean, I think first of all, it just demonstrates the value of trusted sources of news more than ever before. I mean, it's trust is what this is all about, and it's going to become more and more difficult to actually find fact-based sources. So the work that our journalists do is more valuable than ever before. The other thing is just in terms of sort of any legislation or regulatory frameworks, it has to take this into account. We believe our bill does cover this, but as we go through sort of this process of refining the bill, we just want to make double sure that that this is covered under our bill, but our current view is that it is.
Muchas gracias. Y para terminar, me gustaría tener también su mirada sobre otro gran tema que a nosotros nos preocupa como industria, que es obviamente la concentración publicitaria y de los distintos segmentos del negocio publicitario en las plataformas. Sabemos que en enero de 2023 el Departamento de Justicia de los Estados Unidos presentó una demanda contra Google justamente pidiendo que se divida su negocio de la publicidad digital por lo que sería una posición dominante excesiva en el mercado publicitario. Me gustaría tener, por mi parte sería la última pregunta, la mirada de ustedes sobre el tema publicitario y sobre las acciones que se están haciendo en distintos países respecto de la mayor competencia y apertura en este segmento. Y después, si alguien más quiere hacer preguntas, obviamente está abierto a los participantes, agradeciéndoles desde ya, como siempre, su claridad y digamos, y su inteligencia en las respuestas.
Okay. So I guess from our perspective, you know, we applaud what Jonathan Cantor, the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust, is doing. You know, he and the state's Attorney General that he's working with are doing the right thing. You cannot have a market where someone is representing both sides. And in ad tech, you've got Google on both sides of the transaction. They're taking, on average, I believe, 30%. If you think of a stock market, for example, like, I mean, on a transaction, the fact that someone is creaming 30% off the top, it just makes no sense. So this has to be dealt with. The US is doing great work on this. In Canada, our Competition Act doesn't quite have the tools, I believe, that our Competition Bureau needs to address this in Canada. But we believe that, you know, you can't be representing both sides and you can't be taking essentially a 30% cut. It's not fair to publishers. It's not fair to advertisers. And I think both publishers and advertisers have to get a lot noisier on this because we're losing value in this and it's going to one company.
So the only thing that I'll add to that is, and first of all, I'll just say, Paul, we say, because we have found it's not just 30%, it's up to 70% cut. I mean, that's insane.
Yep.
Up to 70% cut of the advertising. And it's because of their extortion and their arbitrage within the advertising ecosystem that has been uncovered in the DOJ investigation that is evidence enough that the judge found that it's worthy of going to trial. And she told Google to put their running shoes on because this is happening. The lawsuit speaks for itself. My members are participating. We have publications pending suit in New York that consolidated their case. And I think it's going to be a tremendous Jonathan has done an amazing job at the DOJ with his case in the ad tech ecosystem. And I'm very eager to see what he does here. As far as the arbitrage and exploitation that I referenced, I'll just say one thing. The New York Stock Exchange, who sits in between, can you imagine if they owned both sides of the ad sell network? I mean, that's what Google is, and that should be a big red flag in the first place. But the fact that sitting in between that exchange, the New York Stock Exchange charges 0.0001% of that exchange, and that's what they charge. And then the fact that Google sits in the same exchange position and charges 19% of every transaction should just speak for itself. We should just walk away and say, there should be no jury. That's the decision. That's just wrong.
Si me permites, Martín,
Sí, claro.
Paul y Danielle, no es una pregunta, pero tal vez necesitamos una apreciación de ustedes, un gut feeling, un gut reaction sobre lo que está pasando en ambos países. Como nunca antes, hay un fuego cruzado en contra de las plataformas. Desde lo que pasó con el Departamento de Justicia, la ley, el proyecto de ley en California, y la gran cantidad de demandas de ciudadanos y de gobiernos estatales en Estados Unidos a las plataformas demandándoles que afectan la salud de los jóvenes, con la adicción de los algoritmos y la falta de transparencia, etcétera, etcétera. Por otro lado, vemos los congresos, nuestros legisladores, como que todavía no entienden muy bien todas las cuestiones de plataformas y medios periodísticos, etcétera. ¿Creen ustedes que la nueva ola de ataques hacia las plataformas, hacia el comportamiento de las plataformas, beneficia a estas leyes en el Congreso o todavía los legisladores están imbuidos de temas comerciales o lo que fuere dentro de sus estados para no actuar con estas dos leyes que aparentemente son correctas? ¿Qué va a pasar? ¿Es algo que el Congreso está o los congresistas se están convenciendo?
I think there's a wave, you're right, Ricardo, there is a wave, where people are concerned legitimately about the activities of big tech. If you look at, they both companies control the central plumbing, whether over search or social. And through that plumbing, you've got clean drinking water, which is the content our journalists produce, but then you've got all of this sewage, and these companies are doing very little to deal with that. And so when they talk about things like blocking news, they're going to devalue their own business. They need quality content, they need trusted content, and that's what we provide them with. At the same time, we have to recognize as publishers that these companies are gatekeepers and important ones at that. They do tremendous innovation. They have brought about all sorts of amazing change. There's good and bad, but they've done a lot of good as well. We have to remember that because we have to work with them. So, our goal is to get through legislation that is fair and balanced, that, ensures the long-term viability of journalism and facilitates the ability for us to work with them. So, we want to work with these companies, and that's something to bear in mind. That I think, their own pushback against regulation is probably making it worse for them. I think they should really work with parliamentarians and members of Congress around the world, have respectful dialogue, and come up with legislation that is balanced and fair. It allows them to thrive and allows us to thrive. That's essentially what we need.
For the US, it might be a little bit different than really anywhere in the world. And that's because these are US companies. And it gets very complicated. And Paul, you saw that with the USTR letter. We can tax our own, but nobody else can. Come on. It's very difficult for our lawmakers. So on the one hand, what Paul said was absolutely accurate, which is our lawmakers see the value of journalism, even though even Republicans who don't like what their hometown paper is, saying about them, they see the value. They do understand that a free press is integral to a functional democracy. Most of them. So there is that belief, but on the other hand, it's very difficult in the US because these US companies have such a home court advantage. They fund so many groups here in DC that are trusted on other issues, that have relationships, that are funding, that are all these reasons, that these relationships that they have with lawmakers that make it tremendously difficult for lawmakers to receive the input from these very credible entities and do the next step, which is to look at where their funding comes from. Google hurts themselves because what they do is they send out blanket talking points and they have people drafting up statements for all these funded groups. And they hurt themselves when all of those same things are using the same stats. In fact, some people get lazy and they just cut and paste. And so the same email comes into Pelosi's office from different groups, and you know where it comes from when they all look the same. That's a big mistake of those. But Google funds news publications, and it makes it look like journalists are against the bill. They fund trusted left-wing think tanks. That makes it look like academics are against the bill. They fund minority groups tremendously and makes it look like minority-owned media is against the bill. They fund right-wing publications that are the worst of the worst and go in and make actual threats in legislators' office saying they'll blow them up if and they're paid by Google and Facebook to do this if they vote for the bill. This is what we're dealing with because they have tremendous influence and they have a lot of money. But what they've learned that other industries haven't, such as oil industry, energy industry, who also have a lot of resources, Google and Facebook are amazing at spending their money effectively. They are very, very good at camouflaging where the money comes from and using it to fund credible sources that confuse our lawmakers. And that's our adversary. That's who we're dealing with. And that's why we're one step ahead of them every step of the way. We also have our own well-funded our own fight and our own armies that we're fighting against them with. But we should not be shy about what we're up against.
Gracias. No sé si alguien quiere hacer alguna otra pregunta.
Ya estamos mal de tiempo, Martín. Te agradezco.
¿No? Sí, ya creo que nos pasamos. Gracias como siempre, Danielle, Paul, son viejos compañeros de ruta de la CIP. Siempre es esclarecedor contar con vuestros comentarios, con vuestra experiencia. Me parece importante, Ricardo, que este panel, que ha sido realmente muy riguroso y con mucha información, podamos tenerlo desgrabado y compartirlo con los socios, con los directores y con los socios de la CIP. Y nos estamos viendo próximamente. Muchas gracias otra vez.
Excelente.